Let's go to the next part, the economy. There's been some major developments here with the Federal Reserve. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. The Federal Reserve has announced now a half-point rate cut yesterday, lowers interest rates by, quote, 50 basis points. You can think of that as 0.5%. It still is the largest reduction, I believe, since 2008, and is the first time since 2020 that a rate cut has been announced now by the Fed. Really what it is that it's an admission by Jerome Powell that this effort to curb inflation just through interest rates is now over. But it also reveals, I think, frankly, an extraordinary failure on their point, because what ended up happening is that we had effectively supply-side inflation that was not entirely fiscally caused. I'm not going to say fiscal policy didn't have any impact on it, but throughout the entire time, recall, we had very, very low unemployment rates. Now we're actually beginning to see those unemployment rates tick up. Inflation, to the extent it has cooled, is largely because, again, of supply-side factors. And all they have done really is jack interest rates up so high that it has made the basic attainment of American life, from a car loan to a house loan, incredibly expensive. The ratio now, where prices where they are at all-time highs or near all-time highs for houses, specifically in like the majority of housing markets, compared then to the mortgage, and then when you put that up against what the average income, or even frankly like a decent income, let's say $120,000 per year, you just put a vast majority of housing unavailable to a lot of people. Another really bad thing that happened is that high interest rates at the current time, at least compared to our like relative history, locked a lot of people in who have low interest rates into their houses. So the housing stock took a dive.
That's right.
And so what happened is that the housing supply actually constricted significantly. Then you had borrowing costs significantly go up. Credit card interest, balance, and all these other things are all-time highs right now. People's savings are very, very low. So I mean, look, I'm happy to see it, I guess. Some people are calling it, election interference and all that. To be honest, like this is part of the problem, I think, with the so-called like independent Federal Reserve and all that. It is actually quite common to cut interest rates in an election year. You could read into that kind of what you will.
Oh, really? It's like statistics.
Dave Ramsey talks about it all the time. He's like, election year is coming. He's like, they're going to cut interest rates. Just because it's one of those where you could also basically bet on it. But also at the current time, it is pretty clear what the net effect of these very high interest rates were, which was very high credit card balances, a mortgage unattainability, locking people, a lot of the housing stock up. The only question is if this is even enough to still unleash, some borrowing or some interest in the real estate market. Just because compared to where a lot of people still are with a 2 or 3% mortgage rate, 5% is still a lot. Especially if you look at the comparison for the same amount of down payment and what your new mortgage would be. In some cases, like thousands of dollars more, depending on the house. Especially if you live in a market like we do in the DMV, where like the average house cost is like $800,000 to $900,000. It's just extraordinary.
Yeah.
What it would cost you.
It's insane. Yeah. The amount of difference at 1 point in the mortgage interest rate.
You should play with those calculators. It's really important to understand.
It's insane. Like I really hadn't done that math until we started looking at it in the context of Fed policy, and I was blown away.
Well, we never needed to because of 2008. So
right.
We just grew up in an area.
Low interest, lower zero interest rates. And when you start looking at it, when your mortgage interest rate is 5%, 6%, 7%, how much of a difference that makes in terms of what you're getting, how much house you can get for your money, it's pretty mind-blowing. So I think that'll be one of the major impacts is, hopefully it will help to start to get more movement in the housing market. I did see that housing starts, like new house building, is up, but not enough to overcome the fact that you have, you can imagine if you have a low mortgage interest rate, even if you kind of want to move or kind of want to get something else, there's no way you're going anywhere until mortgage interest rates come down. So that will certainly be one of the things people will be looking towards. There are a lot of people that argue this rate cut, and I think emblematic of the fact that they went with the, the 50 BPS or the half point rate cut rather than the standard 0.25 percentage point. A lot of people feel like this came kind of too late. Like they hung on to the interest rate, hikes and keeping it static for a little bit too long because we started to see these troubling signs in the labor market in particular, where you're having job misses in terms of the number of new jobs created. You start to have the unemployment rate tick up. And so, there are many who would argue that this actually came a little bit too late, and that's why they're going with this larger rate cut. But, obviously huge impact in terms of the economy. Impossible to predict how much, because these are, there's a lag, and these are very powerful tools, but sometimes it takes some time to see what exactly all unfolds. And also potentially, powerful impact on the political situation, given that we are close to an election, and any positive movement in the economy, which people expect, when lending, when it's cheaper to borrow, it stimulates more economic activity. That's typically how that works. So the expectation is that this will help juice the economy in a way that could be beneficial to Kamala Harris, which is why Trump is not
that's
happy.
why. Well, let's talk about that. Trump addressed this yesterday. Let's go ahead and take a listen.
I guess it shows the economy is very bad to cut it by that much. Assuming they're not just playing politics, the economy would be very bad, or they're playing politics, one or the other. But it was a big cut.
It was a big cut. Trump, a lot of people forget this, but he was obsessed with actually giving credit.
I remember this.
He was smart because he was one of the first presidents to, in a long time. A lot of presidents have this religion around the Fed. They're like, oh, we can't impact the Federal Reserve at all. And he would openly just tweet and berate Jerome Powell, being like, you need to keep interest rates low. It's because of his real estate background. I mean, he knows that he lived through the 70s and the 80s. That's when he made his money. So imagine playing in a world where 19% interest rates. I really honestly can't imagine what mortgage payments and all of that would have looked like, even if the prices were crazy low. So his interest and knowledge of interest rates was one where, as president, he had consistently campaigned to keep low interest rates and to pressure the Federal Reserve, and he understands also the power. Now, as you said, the idea that a low interest rate cut or a cut of 50 basis points is going to materialize in a real way for most people in the span of, 40-something days now to election day? That is kind of ridiculous. But he does understand, too, what the overall economic picture of that can look like. Like, if you're willing to take a federal interest rate view of history, going back and reading the 80s, you really have two choices. You can look at it as a change in interest rates. You can look at a change in fiscal policy. And it kind of tells you, both can tell you a very compelling story as to why growth in an economy occurs or why people feel the way that they do. I think the number one lesson we can all take away is we now all understand why boomers are so obsessed with inflation, because of what it was like to live through the 1970s. And so we didn't get it nearly as bad, but I get it now, in terms of what it looks like. And a lot of people will pay a lot more attention. And politically, of course, inflation is probably the single biggest blow to Biden other than his age, and to Kamala Harris that she has to work through. So we're learning really the impact that has, and it wakes everybody up to what politics looks like.
Yeah, that's right. And let's put this CNBC article up that took a look at some of the overseas, sort of the global impacts of what a Fed rate cut could mean. They say from currencies and commodities, equities to bonds, global markets are braced for that rate cut. This was written before it happened. They talk about how oil and other commodities, which are usually priced in dollars, often receive a boost with the rate cut. A lot of emerging markets very sensitive to these factors. And they say much of the global stock market volatility over recent months was linked to speculation about when and by how much the U.S. central bank will reduce rates. Quote, interest rate cuts reduce the cost of borrowing U.S. dollars, thereby creating easier liquidity conditions for companies around the world. Lower interest rates should also lower the yield available on U.S. assets like treasuries, thus making other markets relatively more attractive. So that's some of the prediction about some of the global ripple effects of the Fed lowering rates. The Fed was actually a little bit slow by global standards. Some other more advanced economies had their central banks had cut rates before we did, even though this is not to minimize the pain of inflation here, but if you look around the world, we actually fared a lot better than many other advanced countries, and were able to lessen inflation more quickly than other advanced economies. So the Fed a little bit behind the curve globally in terms of making this move.
Yeah, you're right. And now we got to turn to some more recent economic news. Trump with one of the most hilarious flip-flops of all time. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. I wonder if he even noticed that he was flip-flopping. So Trump somehow buried this in the middle of a tweet whenever he announced a rally in Long Island, New York, an area that has slowly but surely turned very MAGA. He says, Nassau Coliseum will be a really big deal. It's going to be packed, and it was packed. Hundreds of thousands of migrants crying, etc. What the hell do you have to lose? Vote for Trump. Wait, listen to this. I will turn it around. get SALT back. Lower your taxes. Okay, so we spent hours and hours on this show talking about SALT. It remains one of the most hilarious policy areas in Washington because this is a blue state, specifically rich person obsession. The way it basically works, it's kind of hard to explain, but previously, prior to the 2017 Trump tax bill, blue states where they had high tax rates, let's say California. The easiest way is to think of it
California and New York are
California,
the
New
two
York.
primary.
All right, but California is the easy one, and let's take $1 million. So,
Okay.
and there's a reason I'm saying $1 million because that's really the only people this applies to. If you have $1 million, you have to pay, 13% income tax to the state of California.
Okay.
Okay, so what used to happen is that 13%, 130K roughly, would then get subtracted from your overall federal income taxable burden, as in you would then pay the top individual rate after whatever cutoff on that $800,000. Well, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act removed that so-called SALT beneficiary and made it so that your taxable income at the state level was no longer deductible from your overall tax at the federal level. This massively hurts rich people. So you actually tweeted out this graph, and it's very beneficial. Let's put this up there on the screen. For the absolute vast majority of Americans, this does not matter at all. But as you can see right here, the benefits of a SALT cap, basically what happened is they capped it at just $10,000. If you remove that cap, you massively benefit people who make a lot, high dollar income. So we're not talking about carried interest. We're not talking about stocks. We're talking about specifically people who make over about $1 million a year. So what you could see here from the Tax Policy Center is after you pass the $360,000 level, you start to save a ton of money, especially like I just gave that example, some $5 million. Well, you can imagine now, 13% or whatever of that $5 million then getting knocked off of what you are eligible to then to pay for federal income tax. We are now talking in the ballpark of 5 figures. And so that is something which rich people in blue states and California, New York, but New Jersey as well, and very other ones, this is their number one priority. Has been now for the last, basically, what is it, 2017? So the last 7 years. Josh Gottheimer famously, as we covered here on the show, he called himself Mr. Salt. He even said at one point, quote, "No salt, no dice," because people are up in arms over this.
That was on what was that?
This was during Build Back Better. During both.
Anyway,
basically, he tried to get it all through Congress.
He tried to hold the whole thing hostage.
Yes,
to getting this tax benefit for. He represents New Jersey.
Yes.
And, the rich people in his district, this was priority number one. Right. So I guess he's representing his
representing his constituents.
His donors' interest in particular.
Right.
Because as that chart points out, the TLDR, to make this really simple, is that what Trump is floating here is a major tax cut for the rich. That goes,
specifically the blue rich, which is hilarious.
The rich in New York, New Jersey, California, et cetera. And so, like you said, this was something that was in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It was controversial at the time because Democrats were saying, oh, you're targeting our states, et cetera.
And I'm like, okay, so what?
And then it passes. And not only that, but if you lift the cap and then, you don't make it, it's also it's expensive.
It's extremely expensive.
Yeah.
Because but this is the other.
I'm talking about it's expensive for the federal government.
Right.
Excuse me. It adds significant amount to the deficit. It is a very expensive benefit that you're talking about giving to wealthy blue state denizens. Because wealthy people, they may not pay the same percentage, but the vast majority of the income, is made up of a lot of, let's say, the top 5% of all households in the United States. I forget the exact stats, but it may be something like 50. And actually, in blue states, part of the other reason the blue states hated it is that New York, in particular, especially New York City, they basically designed their entire tax income, their entire tax strategy to rely on the top 100 individuals in the city of New York. So I think it's the top 100 individuals in the city of New York made up almost 50% of all taxation coming in to the overall city. So when just one of those people leaves, it's a disaster. And what happened is that we had massive blue state outflow, specifically of the richest individuals. So for example, you had Ken Griffin move his entire Citadel operation, I think from Chicago down to Miami. There have been multiple very
very wealthy individuals who change their permanent residence and they spend 6 months in one day in Florida and in Texas. And in fact, that's part of the major problems that they've had. So one of the reasons that the blue states have been campaigning so hard is that they are getting hit by this because of out-migration of their wealthiest populations.
And that is, so David Klayan, he was saying, look, there is actually a progressive case for this blue state wealthy. I just want to make the case, like to play devil's advocate
I can give
here.
you a case,
He says, I'm going to stand up for SALT on progressive grounds because someone has to. It's good actually to incentivize the rich to stay in states that tax them and provide services rather than encourage them to relocate to states that don't and forcing austerity in states that do. So he's basically saying, you know, if you don't have this tax deductibility, then it incentivizes a kind of race to the bottom in terms of states just trying to cut their taxes as low as possible, provide very few services to their, you know, lower income population in order to attract the, you know, Ken Griffin or whoever's.
I'll give you the philosophical case. I don't believe this, but I'll give it to you. As it's been made to me, is it's unfair to tax money twice, which again, I don't think that's right, but the philosophical argument is like, look, you're paying 13% on $1 million, but then you're also paying what's the top individual rate, like 37 or something? Whichever part of your income is eligible for that 37, you're getting double taxed on that money, which means you're effectively paying a much higher tax rate. So that's the philosophical argument. The practical argument also is that it incentivizes people not to get paid cash. So what means is that a lot of people in the blue states and others, they change their whole compensation structure. So they're like, look, I don't want money anymore. Pay me in stock, and then I'll let it vest, and I'll just pay long-term capital gains, which is 15%. It's a broader problem, and it's generally indicative of how screwed up our entire tax system is, but that's the only philosophical argument.
Yeah.
Again, I don't believe it. I mean, I just think that especially, I mean, the type of people who make over $1 million a year, there's not a lot of people who make $1 million cash on their W-2 per year. I think it might be less than 1 million people or households in the entire United States.
I mean, to me, this argument makes sense in like a broader context if you were going to do a whole overhaul, because the bottom line is like people who are making that level of income a year, they get off with such a low tax rate.
Generally,
you know?
yes.
They really are. They have so many loopholes that they're able to exploit. They typically pay a lower rate than just like an average middle class person. And so then it makes it very tough for me to swallow like, yeah, but we should still give them this other tax benefit back that they previously had. So broadly speaking, going back to like the Trump point of this is very consistent with the way he has operated in this campaign. I mean, it's been pretty shameless the way that he has given his donor set whatever goodies it is that they're looking for, whether it's consistent or totally, you know, opposite of what he said in the past. This is a very obvious example. The complete 180 on crypto, another very obvious example. Going into a room of oil and gas executives and saying, "Give me $1 billion and I will cut the regulations and make sure that your return on investment is rewarded." I mean, it's just absolutely brazen and shameless. So I think, you know, this falls into this category of he's got some blue state billionaires who are on his team now, and he's like, I'm going to deliver for you. Because most average people, they're not even going to notice the like salt part of that truth. Right. But the people who it's important to, oh, trust me.
This is number one.
Trust me. They are taking a look at that. They are noting that very, very strongly.
Absolutely. Especially the 250K, the 300. I mean, look, I guess, again, I could make a case. Here in D.C., if you make 360 grand, you're not actually that rich. I mean, you are like, you're obviously way more rich than the vast majority of Americans. Yeah, I'm not saying you're a freaking farmer, but you're living, I mean, for example, I remember looking at Kavanaugh's financials. His household income was something like 320K. He was basically living paycheck to paycheck between, it was like Nats season tickets, 2 private school educations, and a very high mortgage on a $1 million plus house. I see that a lot, you know, with a lot of people in this area in particular, just because the cost of living is so high. So for them, you know, a couple of grand that they would be able to save actually is kind of meaningful. So anyways, that is the latest Trump flip-flop.
We're also getting some more on the concept of a healthcare plan.
Oh,
that
right.
It's worth talking about. Let's just touch on this quickly as well. I can put this up on the screen from Axios. They wrote this up. They said the Hill GOP, anyway, is setting their sights on scrapping drug price talks. So one of the accomplishments of the Biden administration that is overwhelmingly popular and the Kamala touts on the trail for good reason quite frequently is on certain drugs, they are now able to negotiate with the Medicare program to lower the cost of those prescription drugs. Well, you have a lot of Republicans in Congress who hate this because, because they're on the take from the pharmaceutical industry, but they say it squashes innovation, blah, blah, blah. That's what they say. So anyway, they've made this a priority to try to, if Republicans are able to gain control, try to get rid of even this, it's a pretty modest reform, frankly, from the Biden administration because it only covers a certain handful of drugs. But in the next administration, there's an additional wave of drugs that would be subject to this price negotiation to lower costs as long as the law remains in place. So Trump hasn't said anything. He uses this general rhetoric about pledging to take on big pharma, blah, blah, blah. But he has not said actually anything specifically about the Republican plans to roll back. This was in the Inflation Reduction Act, these Medicare drug price negotiations.
It'd be a huge fight. If I recall, Josh Hawley actually put it up 51-49 in the Senate, voted on behalf of lowering prescription drug price. This will be a titanic fight. I just looked at it. I couldn't find the exact voting record, but it looks like he sponsored at least some bill. I believe he voted on it on reconciliation because there was a whole Kyrsten Sinema showdown on this as well. The whole point is that this will preview many of what the Trump admin major fights are going to be. We just talked about taxes and SALT. Actually, it's funny because if I were to guess, Republicans would be much more likely not to give him SALT in favor of something like prescription drug price. They don't care about SALT because it's about blue states, and they like it. They think it's funny to tax blue states even more.
Outside of the the Republicans that represent Long Island or places like that.
Right, outside of that. But in the Senate specifically, the Senate, what matters the most in reconciliation. So then it comes back to what their major priority would be. Drug price would actually be probably much more on the table. You should recall this. Both of these are incredibly expensive in terms of the deficit, like you just said. I don't forget exactly. Remember, the prescription drug price legislation is frankly BS, even the way that it's currently been enacted, which is it only allows them to negotiate the top 10 drugs that Medicare buys, not even all the drugs that Medicare buys, even though Medicare is the largest purchaser of pharmaceuticals in the entire United States. So every other, PBM, like Blue Cross Blue Shield, they all get to negotiate, but the government doesn't. They just have to pay.
Yeah,
it's a ridiculous policy.
It should obviously apply to all drugs. It's one of those things you're like, it's an improvement, and it genuinely is. And the top drugs that they're negotiating on,
insulin,
there's been a huge, significant impact for seniors in particular, Medicare recipients. It matters. I don't want to say it doesn't, but this is a very modest reform. And just to rebut directly the argument that Republicans and some Democrats, by the way, make who are on the take with the pharmaceutical industry about this, like, oh, they're not going to have the money for innovation, blah, blah, blah. First, go and take a look at what we pay for these drugs versus everywhere else in the world, and you will be utterly disgusted. Why should our country be the piggy bank for these pharmaceutical giants who are wildly profitable too, by the way?
Filthy rich.
In addition, every single new drug molecule that has been invented in this century has been with the aid of federal tax dollars. By and large, the research and development that these pharmaceutical giants partake in is like, let me reformulate Viagra because it's very profitable so that, it's a different dosage or it's a different delivery mechanism to try to extend patent life. That's a lot of the R&D type, investments that they're making, not developing the new life-saving blah, 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 because that's risky. And by the way, what if not a lot of people have that incurable disease? Then it's not going to be all that profitable. And so that's why public federal funding has been absolutely vital in the development of new drug molecules, and drug company development not so much because they're driven by the profit motive and not, what would actually be like most beneficial to society. So anyway, the talking points against this are total and complete bullshit. And one look at what we pay versus what the rest of the world pays should tell you that.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.